Okay, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. Hope you had a good break. Thanks. Thanks for your attention. So when we left off, we were talking a little bit about some of these policies. So I'm satisfied we've done that. For some people that work for some employers, there are disability pension opportunities. Again, similar concept to Social Security, where you could take that pension earlier than you'd otherwise be able to do on account of disability. So you don't see too many of the what we call like defined benefit pensions in the private sector anymore. They're mostly 401ks, but some employers do. Some people did work for folks like that. In the public sector, much more common. So again, the state retirement system, believe it or not, there's 7 different retirement systems within the state retirement system, but most of them allow public employees to take their pension early if they're permanently incapacitated from doing their particular job with either the state or the city or the county. So it's something that people don't always think about, but something I would encourage you to think about if your loved one is in the position where you have to stop working. So what other options? So private long-term disability, that's the one like I mentioned earlier, where you buy a policy on your own. Obviously, if you already have Parkinson's, that's probably not going to be a financially viable option. But I talk to anybody that'll listen to me, particularly younger people, to say, you think you're going to live forever? You don't. And you think, and the reality is, you have a greater chance of becoming disabled than you do necessarily dying, especially if you're younger, right? And so I really do encourage people to look at those type of policies and buy them when they're young and when they're affordable and before their life gets a lot more complicated, because that can certainly happen. Oh, yeah, so let's talk about that. So the question was like, what's the standard of disability? So in Social Security disability, they look at, can you perform what's called your past relevant work, meaning the work that you did in the 15 years before you became disabled. But they also look at whether you can perform any work in the national economy given your age, your education, and your work history. So for example, if you're a high school graduate, they're not going to say, well, you could do the work of a lawyer because it's mostly a sit-down sedentary job. You don't have the education to be able to do that, right? So it's not just any job type of thing, but it has to be kind of consistent with age, education, and work history. As far as long-term disability policies, one of the most critical things, if you are in a position to buy one, again, if you're part of a group, you don't get to pick the policy. But when I was shopping for our employees, that was something that was very important to me. How does it define disability? So some policies define disability as, we pay if you're in a coma. Most people, thank goodness, are not in a coma, right? And so you don't want to buy that policy. But most policies provide, at least initially, most of the group policies that I've read have what I call a split definition of disability. They say, for the first 2 years that we're required to pay you, we'll pay you if you can't do your particular job with the employer. So if you're a lawyer, they'd say, we will pay you if you can't be a lawyer. After that, for the remaining period of time that we'd be liable to pay you, we pay you only if you're unable to perform any occupation. Again, usually it says consistent with your education and training. So it's not just any occupation, but it's pretty broad. And so when I purchased the own policy that I was underwritten for, that was really important to me. I believe all work is important and valuable and helpful and worthy of pride and respect. But I want to be paid if I couldn't be a lawyer. So when I bought the policy, that's the policy that I had to negotiate for and get. Because if I was able to work at McDonald's, great work, important work, valuable work, but I want to be paid if I couldn't be a lawyer. That was important to me. So you absolutely are right that many times, particularly if you buy your own policy, the definition of disability is really critical. Okay. So sometimes, and this may even apply to some of you now if you're out and been out, some mortgage loans have disability protection. If you become disabled, you're not responsible for paying your mortgage. Some people have that and don't even know it. I've had about 4 clients in my career that I said, check it. They go, I don't have it. I go, humor me, check it. And they found that they had that. And their mortgage was gone. And so that's advice I give to everybody who listens to me. It doesn't happen often, but it can happen, right? So also you'll sometimes find some car loans have disability protection. Some credit cards have disability protection. There are a number of federal laws and even state laws that allow for the waiver of student loan liability if you become disabled. And then also sometimes you're a member of a trade association. You're a member of the American Automobile Association, the AAA, you're a member of other organizations, then they actually have some disability benefits. Also, if you purchased a life insurance policy, so let's say you didn't buy disability, but you bought a life insurance policy outside of work, you bought it individually, you had an annoying brother-in-law that sold insurance, so you bought a life insurance policy. Most life insurance policies that you buy have a waiver of premium on account of disability provision, that if you become disabled, you're no longer required to pay the premium, but the coverage stays in place. So I would encourage you to look at those things. I mean, if you're out there now, even if it's been years since you stopped working on account of disability, you might have some protection there. So again, things like, student loans, car payments, credit cards, mortgages, and of course, life insurance premiums are among things that typically have some form of disability benefit protection. Okay. So as far as that private policy, if you have a private policy, again, you have to get it, you have to read it, and you should apply as soon as possible. And then we just talked about all of these things. So basically, these waiver, student loans, life insurance, other insurance, mortgage, credit cards. It can never hurt to ask. And it can sometimes make life for people a lot less complicated. And then, like I said, can contact organizations which you belong, determine if there's any benefits. And I often encourage people to read, because sometimes you'll get a very unknowledgeable customer service rep. They go, oh, you don't have anything. And then they went and looked at their mortgage documents and they go, there's disability protection here. I paid an extra premium for disability protection. So if you keep the documents, if you have them, always good to look at them and read them, or have someone knowledgeable read them. I wouldn't always necessarily rely on all the customer service folks. Let's talk a little bit about health insurance. So for people who are leaving employment, sometimes that's a big issue, right? And one issue is, do you stay on your employer's plan through what's called COBRA? People know what COBRA is? Okay. So all COBRA is the opportunity for you to stay in your employer's plan, but you have to pay 100% of the premium and sometimes 102% of the premium. Believe it or not, you can be charged 2% for the privilege of the employer getting your check and paying it to Excellus. Isn't that nice? And until recently, I'm old enough where basically the only way you could get health insurance once upon a time was through your employer, right? It wasn't available through what's called the Affordable Care Act, sometimes called Obamacare. So COBRA was really the only ticket in many circumstances. Now, through the Affordable Care Act, there are times that people can qualify for insurance that's just as good as what they had through their employment at little or no cost. So I always try to alert people that, one, COBRA is not necessarily for everybody. You might be able to do better. The other thing that's sometimes tricky is sometimes people separate from employment through a separation agreement where the employer agrees to pay COBRA for a number of months to try to be helpful, and that's a nice thing. The problem is generally you can only get in an Affordable Care Act plan when there's an open enrollment period, or if you lose your employment. So there's a specific exemption in the law that says if you lose health insurance because you've lost your employment, you can get into an Affordable Care Act plan, whether it's an open enrollment period or not. That doesn't apply if your employer pays a few months of COBRA and then you're just out and you're done. So I've had some people kind of fall into that trap, so I try to talk about that as well. Some companies that are larger have special health insurance opportunities for retirees. County Monroe, for example, has some special deals for people that are retirees of the county as far as health insurance that can be helpful. Medicare, as you probably know, are only for people that are 65 and older, or if there are people younger getting Social Security disability. The only way you qualify for Medicare is you have to wait 2 years from the first month that you're eligible for Social Security disability benefits. So if you became disabled today, no one's paid for the first 5 full months you're unable to work due to disability. So God forbid somebody got hit by a truck today, they were disabled today, the waiting months for them would be March, April, May, June, and July. That means August of 2025 is the first month they'd be eligible for Social Security disability benefits, and they would not be eligible for Medicare until August of 2027. So keeping health insurance in place, whether it be through the Affordable Care Act, through COBRA, through Medicaid, some way, that's critically important. It's easier now than when I first started practicing, when COBRA was pretty much it, but that's something that's important. Okay? People had experiences. Anyone had, the health insurance been pretty, I don't want to say easy to navigate. I wouldn't say that, but does anybody have any questions relative to health insurance? Not that I know a whole lot about it, but has everybody got something they're pretty comfortable with, I hope? Okay. Hearing nothing, I hope that's true. Yeah, so we talked about Social Security disability, and Medicare goes with that for the reasons I just mentioned. For people on SSI, Medicaid can often be an option. So Medicaid is a health insurance. So Medicare is the health insurance program for people who are 65 and older, or people that are getting Social Security disability once they've exhausted the waiting period. Medicaid is a health insurance program for people of very modest means or almost no means. That includes children, that includes parents that have never worked outside the home. But in order to qualify for Medicaid, you have to have little or no resources. Some resources are exempt, some are not. There is a wonderful local nonprofit law firm here in Rochester called the Empire Justice Center. They assist folks with Medicaid applications. They assist folks in SSI cases for free. They're really pretty terrific. So as a result of that, because I send folks there, I don't really have a whole lot of knowledge about Medicaid, but Medicaid is one that you can qualify for, but you have to have modest resources. I hope no one in this room is broke enough, so to speak, to qualify for Medicaid, but it can be helpful to people on an interim basis while they're waiting. So before we talk about some of these documents, let's just pause for a minute. Questions, things that are on your mind, anything kind of jumping out at you as we're going forward? Okay, not hearing anything. So let's talk about some planning documents. And again, these are not things that I draft or know how to draft. I had to go to a lawyer and get these documents done for me and my family. But let me tell you why they're important. Wills and trusts. The state has some laws that will dictate what happens to your possessions and property if you don't designate that. And that is often not in your interest. It can often create a level of family discord, right? If Uncle Bill didn't quite get divorced from his wife and still, they haven't been together for 50 years, but they never got divorced. And now, she's inheriting a whole bunch of money. That doesn't create a lot of happy and nice feelings, right? So ordinarily, it's wise for you to give some thought about what you'd like to see happen and what important decisions are made. Also, for those folks who are lucky enough to have some decent assets, tax liability can be really important. So what you do and how you plan can often determine how much in taxes that you pay. So it also can determine whether there might be a credit against your state. So for example, if you have a loved one and you have a life insurance policy and you make the policy payable to your state on your death, it goes into the pool of the estate. If you die with a lot of debt, then MasterCard can go and make a claim against that money and grab some of that money. If you give that money, if you put on the beneficiary, you leave it to your loved one, your spouse, that person didn't guarantee your debt, that life insurance proceed money goes to your spouse, and he or she doesn't have to pay, MasterCard. So planning is really important. It's not just for rich people. Sometimes people think, I don't need a will, I don't need a trust, it's only for rich people. That's not true. So one of the things, for example, I think I told you my wife has multiple sclerosis. So we were pretty concerned about if I were to die and leave some money to her, would that make her ineligible for nursing home and other type of care that she might need given her circumstance? And so we created a trust so that in the event of my death, monies would go into a trust, that her two sisters were the trustees of that trust, and they could we trusted them to make decisions for her, but also that would make her eligible for some benefits and some opportunities that she wouldn't have if I left that money to her. Essentially, unfortunately, under our current system, people who save get penalized. If I would have left the money to her and she needed it, the government would have said, you got to spend that money down. Nice that you had a husband that thought of you, that bought a life insurance policy, but you have to pay that down. Whereas someone who didn't do that or put that money in trust gets 100% of that money paid for by the government. Regardless of the politics of all that stuff, it just doesn't seem like it's an equitable and fair system. So it is in your interest to do some planning. And so I would encourage you to do that. In addition, what can be important are things like a power of attorney healthcare proxy. Healthcare proxy, something you don't think you'll ever need. My mother had a massive stroke and she could not make healthcare decisions. And the doctors came to us and said, what do you want to do? And we had to make that decision. But because she gave us that opportunity, we had the ability to do that. And we certainly didn't love the fact that we had to make that decision. But the option for the hospital would be to go to a judge and have a judge make that decision. And I've been involved in cases as a lawyer where we had people that didn't have that protection in place, that were not competent to make healthcare decisions, where we had to go to court and litigate the issue of whether a person should have a very significant surgery. That's not something that judges like doing. It's not something lawyers like doing. It's not something that we should be doing. But when people don't plan, that's the stuff that can happen. So it's critically important that you consider a healthcare proxy for someone that you trust that will make appropriate decisions for you, because it's the angst of a family who, like what we went through. I can't imagine what that had been like if we didn't have that direction in place and somebody else had to make that decision, right? So it's important. And a power of attorney gives someone that you trust the ability to make some decisions for you. If you're incompetent, you could sometimes give that power to someone if you're not incompetent, but you can limit it to the fact that if you're not competent to make a decision, that person has the ability to do some things. Otherwise, you have to go to court, for example, to go to your bank account. If you have given someone that authority, they have the ability to do some things for you, pay your bills while you're incompetent or incapacitated in a way that, they'd have to go to court, get a court order. It just makes life a whole lot complicated. And again, these documents can generally be prepared at a relatively modest expense, and the planning can be really helpful. Kevin. Yeah, and again, this is a little bit, I don't do estate planning, so it's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. But again, it's a matter of, they have sometimes things called a durable power of attorney, which means it lasts if and when you become incapacitated. You have other ones that would expire at the time of incapacity. New York has done a pretty good job of modifying the power of attorney law to make it simpler. But I have to tell you, when I look at it, my eyes glaze over a little bit too. So it's not the easiest thing, and I'm not going to really explain it well enough for your benefit. But New York has a specific statute. Do not go on the internet and download something that you're told is a good power of attorney in New York. It usually is not. I had a client who tragically, just their husband was a firefighter. He had a massive stroke. He died. They had they went on the internet, 6 months before he had the unexpected massive stroke, and they got all these documents, all of which were worth nothing, and they didn't help. And he had to go through the whole process, and it just made life a lot more complicated. So Google is good. You probably hear this, doctors say Google is not a substitute for my medical education. I will say Google is not a substitute for my law school education. There's a lot of good stuff you could find on the internet, but be wary of those kind of documents that say, yeah, it's fully approved. I'm wary of those things, and I think you should be too. Okay, but I didn't do a very good job explaining that. But just suffice it to know that there is a statute, there is a form. Most competent lawyers that do estate planning can explain that better. But also, these things work together. So what you do on your power of attorney can influence what you do in your healthcare proxy, can influence what you do in your will and a trust if you decide to create that. So all those things kind of fit together, and most competent, good estate planning lawyers can work you through all those things. And the other thing to think about is it's not a one and done issue. So my daughter now is 35 years old. She's turned 35. She has a baby, so I'm a grandfather. I really love that. But when we wrote our will initially, she was a kid. So we had to say, what happens if we're both if we're in a plane and we die? Who's going to take care of our child, right? And so now our considerations are different. So it's a living document, meaning you don't just write the will when you're 35 years old and put it away and never think about it. That you have to kind of think about that every couple of years, or certainly when your life circumstances change. And I can't tell you how many times people have kind of forgotten to do that, and they wind up putting themselves in a very difficult situation from an estate tax perspective. Or, like I said earlier, and this has happened more than a few times, I had a client once who went through a very ugly divorce, never changed the beneficiary document of life insurance. He gets killed in an accident, and the spouse that cheated on him got a huge life insurance payout. And she contacted me and says, what do I do? I go, what do you want to do morally, or what do you do legally? I mean, legally, you're entitled to the benefit. I can't tell you you're not entitled to it. Would I take it? That's between you and whoever your creator is. But that's the kind of stuff that can happen, and it created all kinds of problems and difficulties in that family. And I think you can understand why. So not fun to think about death, not fun to think about disability, not fun to think about any of those things. But as adults, we have to do a lot of unfun things. And I often say, if I knew how hard it was being an adult, I would have stayed a kid way longer. But I don't have that option anymore. It ain't. You're absolutely right, sir. Okay, so that's enough of my. And then also, mentioned as far as trust, there's a thing called supplemental needs trust, which means you can put some things into a trust that will not disqualify a person from being eligible for other type of government benefits. And again, I'm telling you what little I know, but these are some of the things that are at issue. And again, those documents generally are power of attorney, healthcare proxy, and a will. So questions, that's a lot. I gave you a lot to kind of digest, and I hope it wasn't too overwhelming. Um, but what kind of questions do you have, either about this or anything? I tell people you've got access to free legal services right now, so take advantage. Be careful. Sometimes you get what you pay for, but I'm happy to answer the questions that you have. Yes. Anyway.
We just moved here from Oregon, and we have power of attorney. We've got will, blah blah blah. Are they good in New York City?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I would say that if you're living now and working, if you're living here in New York, then you would be wise to have a New York lawyer take a look at that, just to be, because again, likely the place where you live is the place where any dispute or probate would be of any will. Also, the healthcare proxy. The problem is people are familiar with what they're familiar with, right? So if God forbid you went to Strong Memorial Hospital and you give an Oregon healthcare proxy, they're going to look at it and go, "What the hell is this?" They're just used to kind of seeing the New York form and the New York documents. So I think you'd be wise to consider looking at that. And it might be a good time. Like, when's the last time that you had those documents prepared? Do you remember?
Some of them, like the proxy stuff.
Oh, okay.
The will was, I don't know.
Yeah, and listen, you've gotten better looking in those 15 years, I'm sure, but your life may have changed in some other ways too, right? And so it's worth just taking a look at that. And again, there are a lot of good practitioners. We're really lucky in Rochester. We're a small enough city where people are still pretty kind to each other and good, but we're big enough where we have a lot of very good, competent lawyers. And so the trick sometimes is finding those people. I don't think a billboard is the best way to find a lawyer. I think talking to a guy like Dan Cannell, or talking to a gentleman here, he's a lawyer as well. That word of mouth is really important. Finding out people who are good and honest and credible people. You can't always determine that by going on the internet and Googling people. Although Google reviews can often be helpful, right? I think that is certainly a way to identify at least what other consumers' experience has been with lawyers. But feel free to talk to somebody you know and trust. That's a much better way to get a lawyer than any other way. Yeah.
I was just curious, in terms of having a lawyer do a package of things.
Yep.
Blah, blah, blah. What's a range of?
Yeah.
You don't have a terribly complicated.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's probably some variety from people what they charge, but I would think that would be like probably a $500 to $1,000 item, something like that. Yep, yep, yep. And you could shop that a little bit. You can call a couple different people and say, "Hey, what's your rate?" That's not inappropriate. You'll find some variety, variant in what people do. Some people kind of limit themselves, to very high net worth people. They do complicated tax planning. Other people do mostly simple stuff. So there's not necessarily one size fits all, but it's more reasonable than you'd think. Other questions? All right. Well, it's starting to snow, so that's exciting because we haven't had enough snow lately. That's great. But I do appreciate. I know that they're going to make available these slides on the internet. So just a little bit about us. Like I said, these are most of the practice areas that we're in. If you need some help and assistance, I left some cards out of the table there. If you have a question or something like that, and feel free to raise it. But I really do appreciate your comment, and I really appreciate what folks are doing for each other here. I mentioned earlier to Yvonne, the peer support is really critical, right? Again, my family's been living with multiple sclerosis since 1992. We've got a lot of peer support. And that's really important because a lot of times when you're first going through this, whether it's you or a loved one, you think you're the only person who's ever dealt with stuff like this. And you realize you're not. And that can really help. But also you can get some great ideas about what doctors to talk to, what doctors to run away from, what lawyers to talk to, what lawyers to run away from, right? And that can be really important too. So I really appreciate the fact that you've taken the time to come here on a Saturday and do this. And I'm really grateful for the work that Dan and Kevin and Yvonne do. Because this is really, really important stuff. So continue doing what you're doing. Thanks, everybody. Okay.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to all of you for coming today and putting yourself at risk out there on the road. Please be careful driving home. My wife is holding up something. Expo, April 26th. Check out the website for more information about that. I hope that we'll see you all there for that event. Thank you again for coming.
Register for that now. way to register.
I should mention that. Thank you. You do not have to register for the PD Expo. Just show up. It's running from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Just show up. It's like a trade show sort of environment. Walk in, walk through, grab a cookie, grab a cup of coffee, and we hope to see you all there. Thanks again. Next spring.
I'm not sure how to shut that off. Oh.
Doesn't want to turn on. Oh, I bet I know why.